In 224 BC, the Qin general Wang Jian marched 600,000 men south to conquer the kingdom of Chu. 600,000. To put that in perspective, the entire Roman army at the height of the empire never exceeded 400,000 across all its legions, spread across 3 continents. Wang Jian concentrated more soldiers in a single campaign than Rome could field across the known world. But here is the part that should be impossible. Those 600,000 men marched for weeks through humid, subtropical terrain, drinking from rivers they had never tested, sleeping in mud, sweating through clothing that never fully dried. In every other army in the ancient world, that is a death sentence. Not from enemy swords, from dysentery, from cholera, from the invisible massacre that historically killed more soldiers than any weapon ever forged. Wang Jian's army arrived intact. They fought, they won, and the kingdom of Chu, which had resisted Qin expansion for over a century, collapsed in under 2 years. How? Because the Qin military possessed a weapon that no one talks about. Not bronze, not crossbows, not discipline, something far stranger. They deliberately fed their soldiers live bacteria. Welcome back to Silk Road Annals. Part 1. The Mathematics of Death. To understand why this matters, you first have to understand the scale of ancient Chinese warfare, because nothing else in the ancient world comes close. During the Warring States period, Chinese commanders routinely deployed armies of 100,000 to 400,000 conscripts in a single campaign. The Battle of Changping in 260 BC allegedly involved over 1 million men on both sides. Whether that exact figure is accurate, the archaeological evidence at Changping, mass graves containing tens of thousands of skeletons, confirms that the scale of slaughter was real. Compare that to the Mediterranean world. The Roman Republic's largest single battle deployment was roughly 87,000 men at Cannae in 216 BC, and that was considered extraordinary. The Chinese were operating at a completely different order of magnitude. Now, here is the question that military historians rarely ask. What happens biologically when you concentrate that many human beings in one place? You get a catastrophe. For most of human history, the greatest killer in warfare was not combat. It was disease, dysentery, typhoid, cholera, gastrointestinal infections that tore through overcrowded camps like wildfire. During the American Civil War, 2,000 years after Wang Jian, disease still killed roughly twice as many soldiers as bullets did. During the Napoleonic Wars, entire campaigns were decided not by battlefield genius, but by which army's intestines collapsed first. The ancient Chinese military strategist Sun Tzu calculated that a standard campaign required 100,000 soldiers, 1,000 supply wagons, and the ability to transport provisions across 1,000 li, roughly 300 miles. What Sun Tzu did not write down, because every commander already knew it, was the real constraint. How do you keep 100,000 digestive systems functioning across 300 miles of hostile terrain? The Qin state solved this problem, and the solution was so effective that it remained a cornerstone of Chinese military logistics for over 2,000 years. Part 2. Weaponizing the microbiome. While European armies, centuries later, were still issuing their soldiers hardtack, a rock-hard flour biscuit with almost zero nutritional value, and salt-preserved meat that destroyed their kidneys over long campaigns, the Qin and Han military apparatus had already institutionalized something radically different: the mass production of live fermented cultures as standard military rations. The system rested on 3 pillars: sufu, a fermented, mold-ripened tofu that could last for months without refrigeration; fermented soybean paste, the ancestor of what the Japanese would later refine into miso; and deeply fermented pickled vegetables preserved in brine and lactic acid. Now, originally, fermentation was simply a preservation technology. In a world without refrigeration, you either fermented food, salted it, or watched it rot. What made the Chinese system exceptional was the observation that followed. Military commanders noticed that units supplied with fermented rations consistently suffered fewer casualties from camp diseases than units without them. This was not modern clinical science. This was pattern recognition across decades of campaigns encoded into logistics doctrine. 2,000 years later, modern microbiology finally explained why. Foods like tofu and lacto-fermented vegetables are dense with specific probiotic bacteria, including strains of Lactobacillus and Bifidobacterium. When consumed regularly, these bacteria colonize the gut and form a competitive barrier against pathogenic microbes. In clinical terms, they outcompete the bacteria that cause dysentery and cholera for the same biological real estate inside the intestine. A 2019 meta-analysis published in The Lancet found that regular consumption of fermented foods significantly reduced the incidence of upper respiratory and gastrointestinal infections. Modern military researchers have actually studied probiotic supplementation for deployed soldiers for exactly this reason. The Qin generals did not have microscopes, but they had something almost as powerful: a logistics system sophisticated enough to track which rations correlated with healthier armies, and a centralized state willing to standardize production based on those results. There is one more dimension to this that modern science is only beginning to understand: the gut-brain axis. Recent research has established that gut microbiome composition directly influences neurotransmitter production, particularly serotonin, roughly 90% of which is produced in the gut, not the brain. Dysbiosis, an imbalance of gut bacteria, is now associated with elevated anxiety, impaired decision-making, and reduced stress tolerance. Now, it would be an overstatement to claim that the Qin generals consciously engineered their soldiers' mental resilience through probiotics. They almost certainly did not think in those terms. But it is reasonable to hypothesize that armies with healthier gut microbiomes experienced measurable cognitive advantages: better morale, clearer thinking under stress, faster recovery from the psychological shock of combat. Benefits that would have been attributed to discipline or divine favor, but that may have had a biological foundation no one could yet name. Part 3. The protein problem. A fortified gut keeps a soldier alive on the march. It does not give him the raw muscle power to draw a heavy crossbow or swing a halberd in close formation for hours. For that, you need concentrated protein. And protein, in the ancient world, was a logistical nightmare. Fresh meat rots. In subtropical heat, it becomes dangerous within hours. Every ancient army faced this problem, and most solved it badly. Roman legions marched with herds of live pigs and cattle. These animals moved slowly, required their own food and water, and their noise and smell announced the army's position from miles away. Centuries later, Mongol cavalry reportedly placed strips of raw meat under their saddles, using the horse's body heat and the friction of the ride to tenderize it. Effective for small, fast-moving raiding parties, completely impractical for a 600,000-man army. The Chinese solution was dried, spiced meat, and the process reveals a level of food science that is genuinely remarkable for the ancient world. Historical sources describe a method where poultry, typically free-range roosters that had been raised on insects and grain for at least a year to maximize muscle density, were slaughtered using a specific dry method that kept water from contacting the meat, preventing the initial bacterial colonization that triggers decay. The meat was then heavily marinated with precise ratios of salt, Sichuan peppercorns, star anise, and cinnamon, then hung in open air for roughly 25 days until the fat had fully rendered out and the remaining flesh had hardened into a dense, shelf-stable protein source. What you end up with is essentially an ancient high-protein ration that weighs almost nothing, resists spoilage for months, and the spice profile, particularly the Sichuan peppercorn, actually served a secondary logistical function. It stimulated saliva production and gastric motility, meaning soldiers could digest their rations more efficiently even under the physical stress of forced marches. Compare this to what European soldiers were eating 1,000 years later during the Crusades. Salt pork, so heavily preserved, it had to be soaked for hours before it was edible, and even then, it provided minimal usable protein while overloading the kidneys with sodium. The gap in military food science was enormous. Part 4. The golden fuel of the empire. Protein rebuilds muscle. Probiotics protect the immune system. But an army runs on carbohydrates. Without a reliable, transportable source of baseline caloric energy, nothing else matters. Archaeological excavations at sites like Matengkong, dating to the Warring States and early Qin period, reveal that the state managed a sophisticated, multi-cropping agricultural system. But the grain that fueled the military was not wheat, which was often reserved for elite consumption and ancestral sacrifices. It was foxtail millet. Millet is, from a military logistics standpoint, close to a perfect grain. It is drought-resistant, meaning the state could grow it reliably even in bad years. It has an exceptionally high 1,000 kernel weight ratio, a measure of nutritional density relative to size and mass. It stores well without specialized infrastructure, and when boiled into a thick porridge or baked into hard cakes, it releases energy slowly as a complex carbohydrate, sustaining a soldier's output over hours rather than delivering a short spike and crash. When you stack these three systems together, the picture becomes clear. The Qin or Han soldier on campaign would eat his millet for sustained energy. He would chew on dense, spiced, dried meat to rebuild torn muscle tissue. And he would consume his fermented soybean paste and pickled vegetables to maintain gut integrity and immune function. This was not accidental. This was a state-level logistics system administered by a bureaucracy that tracked agricultural output, standardized ration composition, and distributed supplies through a network of granaries and supply depots that archaeologists are still mapping today. The Qin Empire did not simply conquer through superior weapons or ruthless discipline. It conquered because it could keep more men alive, functional, and combat-ready across greater distances and longer campaigns than any rival state. Conclusion: the Clay Guardians. In 1974, farmers digging a well near Xi'an broke through the earth and into the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century. 8,000 life-size terracotta soldiers, standing in perfect battle formation, guarding the tomb of Qin Shi Huang, the man who unified China. Each figure is unique. Individual faces, individual armor configurations, individual hairstyles denoting rank and unit. They were modeled on real soldiers, men who marched real campaigns, men whose bodies were sustained by a logistical system so sophisticated that modern nutritional science needed 2,000 years and electron microscopes to fully explain why it worked. The central tomb chamber remains sealed to this day. Ancient historians wrote that it is protected by crossbow traps on hair triggers and rivers of liquid mercury designed to simulate the great waterways of the empire. Modern mercury soil analysis around the burial mound has confirmed abnormally high concentrations, suggesting that at least part of that account is true. We may never open it. Exposure to modern air and humidity would likely destroy whatever survives inside within minutes. But the emperor's greatest weapon was never locked in that tomb. It was not his crossbows, his bronze swords, or his terracotta guardians. It was the understanding that an empire is built on the health of the men who fight for it. That conquest is not decided in the moment a blade meets flesh. It is decided weeks earlier, in the supply depot, in the granary, in the fermentation jar. 8,000 clay soldiers still stand in the dark beneath Xi'an, silent, patient, fed by an empire that understood what most of the world would not learn for another 2 millennia. that the most powerful weapon in war is not what you carry in your hand, it is what you carry in your gut.